So our final talk of this session is from the other end of the British Isles, and we'll move to Anglesey. And Jack Bamber and Craig Shuttleworth are going to talk to us about, I've not actually got the titles on here, Futureproofing for Conservation Success. So Jack has been working with Red Squirrels Trust Wales for the last 3 years. He originally got involved during his master's thesis, where he assessed the red squirrel translocation success at, you need to correct my pronunciation, Brackmillan? Yes. Okay, good. So he's since moved through various roles, been an operative and a red squirrel ranger, and I believe you're moving to Aberdeen soon for PhD research, which is great. Craig has been studying squirrel ecology from '93. I'd be surprised if you don't know who Craig is. And he's involved with translocation projects and advises the Cornwall Red Squirrel Project.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much,
No
Aileen.
problem.
Thank you. Just make sure. Can you hear me okay? Is that all right? Is that fine? Yeah. Okay, well, pine martens. As Aileen said, I mean, most of the work I've done in the past has been red or grey squirrels, but now we find ourselves with pine martens. Pine martens, of course, is a native mammal, and to illustrate that here, it's a native of Europe, a native of the Republic of Ireland, and a native of the UK. So across the British Isles, it's a native species. Sometimes we forget about that because it's been absent for many areas for so long that people have this view of it as something that shouldn't necessarily be there. So what is a pine marten? Well, if you look on the Mammal Society website, you'll see that they give you the length of the martens and their body weights. I think probably the most important and relevant thing, it's cat-sized. It's about the size of a medium cat, domestic cat. It's arboreal, and its diet is, well, it's an omnivore, so it's going to eat basically anything it comes across. If it came across owls, it might be interested in those. As we know, they don't eat red squirrels because the red squirrels bounce at the end of the branch, gently, swaying in the breeze. Might eat a curlew or two, that's possible. What we do know that they eat is a lot of fruit, berries, small mammals. This is the field vole. Field vole cycles in its population every 3-4 years, reaches highs and then declines. And marten diet will reflect that. So they're really reflecting the wide variety of different foods that they encounter in the environment. Now, I don't want to really dwell on the negatives of martens. If you're interested in our views on this, we published in the Geography magazine. Matt Hayward and I had something in the Conversation magazine 2 years ago. I think we entitled it, Why the Pine Marten's Not Every Red Squirrel's Friend. We showed this image, which is a marten making an acquaintance with some red squirrels at night. Interestingly, they're not doing the bouncy thing, are they? They're on the edge of the... and we've also spoken to a lot of landowners, an awful lot of landowners. In fact, the videos that we're going to show later, that Jack's going to show, are all shot on land owned by sheep farmers. So farmers are the ambassadors for our project. And that's because it's really important to avoid the sort of car crash that we've had in mid-Wales with the Summit to Sea rewilding project, which basically got £3 million to try and do work on other people's land before they actually asked them whether they would like to have that work carried out. And that's been an interesting example. So this project really came about, I suppose, in 2016, 2017. I got an invite over to Canada, and they have the American marten there. And that's where the grey squirrels came from. This figure here shows you distribution of American marten and the fisher, so another mustelid. And then we've got the distribution of the eastern grey squirrel. And so what you'll hear typically is that grey squirrels didn't evolve with an arboreal predator because their range is largely discrete from American marten. However, if you go over to Western Canada, to Vancouver Island, it's got one of the highest densities of American martens in the whole of the north. And guess who's there? Grey squirrels in Victoria, and they're moving up through Nanaimo and up northward on the island. So obviously they've not read the script. What I'm trying to get across is we should be careful not to just read into a small number of studies or a couple of perspectives. Once you start to read around a subject, you find actually it's incredibly complicated. So when I was there, I wanted to see some American martens. And so I went to the John Prince Research Forest, and what I found was shoe trees. And I suppose, did I see any American martens? Well, kind of. I had a friend who emptied his freezer, a fur trapper. And this is actually really interesting because this shows you what they're like without the skin on. The fluffy cats disappeared, and now you can really see it's a very long and agile animal. There's not really that much to them. They're coming in about 1.5 kilos. Coming back to translocations, why would we want to translocate, you're going to see, captive martens? Well, and this is the Tasmanian devil. The Tasmanian devil, very common animal. And then, of course, this virus came along which produced tumours. And this was an epidemic. If you ask the Tasmanian devil experts to explain their knowledge of captive breeding of Tasmanian devil, there was none. No one knew anything about it. They do now, of course, they're international experts because they had to translocate, move animals in from the wild into captivity, learn how to breed them, learn how to reintroduce them. And so we decided to try this with pine marten. And initially it wasn't that successful. We had the enclosure which was housing the marten was hit by Storm Emma and destroyed, and it got out. I wish I'd had a video of this because the ground there was lifting up a couple of feet with the swaying of trees. You can't see them, but there were some huge conifers here. Because the ground was frozen, it was actually ripping out, and it had torn all the mesh underneath the enclosure, and part of the enclosure had actually been sucked underneath this big root plate. So I thought that this marten was dead. We couldn't talk about her, so we called her Macbeth. But she turned up, thanks to volunteers in the RSU project. She turned up, and she turned up down in the Vaynol estate, which is 11 kilometres away. She's a female. And if you read some of the background literature you find for Fisher females that are translocated, they tended to move around about 10 to 11 kilometres. So she had read the script. And she did all the behaviours that you would expect for a wild animal. We saw scent marking, we saw vigilance behaviour, we saw feeding. Her condition looked good. And that took us on to the translocation, fully IUCN screened, and we're working with a number of zoos.
Well, we've already had one new set of arrivals on the programme, but you can get 2 for the price of 1 tonight. A new youngster is enjoying life at the Welsh Mountain Zoo at Colwyn Bay. It's the first to be born in 15 years. We won't tell you what it is, but Ian Lang found out they don't stay still for very long.
When you were just a few months old and there's an entire new world to discover, well, maybe it's difficult to stay still for very long. The world for this baby pine marten may be confined to an enclosure at the Welsh Mountain Zoo in Colwyn Bay, but it's very roomy and comfortable. Proud mum and dad are nearby, there's plenty of food, so it's a perfect playpen.
We're generally excited that this is our first pine marten youngster that we've had in a very long time. And they're newborn and new parents as well, so they're doing really well at the moment. Having a baby means there's a future possibility of it being re-released back into the wild to help boost wild pine martens in Wales. So for us, that's quite a good thing because zoos are about conservation at the end of the day.
I mean, the zoo is part of many national and international breeding programmes, but I think this one holds a special place in our heart. With being the National Zoo of Wales and with the pine martens being a native species, it's sort of, it's very important for us, and it makes us feel, great that we are able to breed these animals.
Pine martens are native to North Wales, although their numbers plummeted during the 18th and 19th century and have failed to recover. So when helping in any recovery, it's important that captivity is as close to the wild as possible.
At the end of the day, they're still wild animals. So even though they're born in captivity, we're not stroking them, we're not hand-feeding them, we're not mollycoddling them, so we still want that wild instinct there. So you try and make it as natural as possible. So I've got a log pile in here, there are different plants that I've planted in here.
For visitors, it was certainly something new.
That's the first time I've ever seen one. I wouldn't have even, if you'd have said to me, what is it? I said, I don't know.
They're very cute.
And then they talk about the pine martens where they're coming back into the country and they're starting to rebreed and everything, so I think it's really good.
One question remains, boy or girl. That'll be settled with a check-up. In the meantime, the zoo is just very proud of its latest arrival. Ian Lang, ITV News, Colwyn Bay.
So it does turn out that it was a male in the end, and it's one of the animals that we've been using in our translocation process.
We've already...
If it will go past that. So why are we interested in Red Squirrel Trust Wales in doing this translocation of pine martens? Well, Anglesey was quite a success story for red squirrels. Eradication occurred, as we've heard earlier, and then with restoration programs of red squirrels back onto the island, the population has now grown from around about 40 individuals up to 800 to 900 individuals. Now, this has also caused the spread of red squirrels naturally into Gwynedd County, along the coast, in Treborth Botanical Gardens and other areas. And then alongside that, there have been translocation releases up in Breakmillan Forest, which is how I originally worked with the Red Squirrel Trust. But this in itself presents its own issues. So by having red and grey squirrels within Gwynedd interacting with each other regularly, it exposes the fact that grey squirrels can get back onto the island, and even to the point where yesterday, as we were travelling up here, we've had a report of a grey squirrel getting back onto Anglesey. It obviously heard we were in Newcastle for the weekend. But then it also provides the potential for the interactions to spread squirrel pox onto the red squirrels. Now we've got lots of wonderful volunteers who are monitoring and know when grey squirrels get onto the island, but the movement of red squirrels back onto Anglesey will not be monitored as much. So if a red squirrel contracts squirrel pox on the mainland and goes back onto the island, that presents a massive risk to the population of Anglesey. So one of the aims was to try and expand the buffer zone from Anglesey out into Gwynedd. This would then reduce the chance of the animals that may be infected or grey squirrels getting onto the island, but unfortunately eradication wasn't possible across the entirety of Gwynedd. So then it's looking now about ways that we can develop and progress into the future. So obviously, as Craig has said about the martens, there's all this research that has come out recently about the potential positive correlation that pine martens have with red squirrels. Now, nobody particularly knows whether that is 100% the case or what is causing that, but research has shown that where pine martens are present, grey squirrel numbers go down and the occupancy of reds goes up. It could be because they're eating them. It could be because red squirrels bounce on the end of twigs and manage to get away from pine martens. The jury's out on that. But it also could be that the pine martens scare the grey squirrels out of the area because they're not used to them. But the release of pine martens would need to be used alongside other sorts of control management because it's not going to be 100% effective. It's not going to be a cure-all solution. So, as Craig said, we've worked very closely with local landowners. We're performing this release to try and provide an ecosystem service. It's not just bringing pine martens in and releasing them just for the sake of pine martens. It has got a purpose, and we want to hopefully assess if these animals can be used as a successful control measure to control grey squirrels and try and improve the conservation of red squirrels. So, why use captive animals? Well, Craig touched upon the genetic variability and how you can bring translocations in to try and prevent the spread of disease in animals, and that if genetically the population is quite susceptible to certain disease, you're going to require other genetic populations to be put in to try and help build up a resistance. And it also means that you can actually use these captive breeding programs that are going on within zoos within the UK to actually have a conservation potential. That's something that's highlighted by many zoos as stuff that they want to get involved with. But that does have its problems. Captive bred animals are notoriously difficult to reintroduce back into the wild. They don't necessarily build up the skills that you would expect animals to have if they're already being taken from a wild population. So this is an issue when trying to release captive animals, but it does present other things that you can do. You can assess these animals prior to the release. You can look at their different sort of personality responses, their activity rates. You can expose them to nest boxes and radio collars before they are released and try and see how these animals respond. And that essentially would allow you to select the right individuals for release programs. So this is what I've done alongside lots of the RSTW volunteers, which I was very grateful for, because anyone that's sifted through thousands upon thousands of camera trap images, it's no fun doing it on your own, especially when all you get is a few blurry images of a pine marten leg. So what we did was I put camera traps up into the release pens. These were set to monitor the animals for whole 24-hour periods. This would allow me to see when the animals were active and what they were doing. We also looked at whether we put them onto a more natural diet in the original zoos, they were probably getting fed more day-old chicks, etc., cat food, not the stuff that they'd be eating in the wild. So we moved them on to grey squirrels mainly, because that's what we have readily available, funnily enough. But then we also could look at the response that these animals have to humans as well. Obviously, we were going to the pens quite regularly. You don't want them to have a massive association with people, so this was another thing that you can look at for the animals that you might release. So here's just a quick video, if it'll play. The first two videos are my ploy to show you how cute pine martens can be. So that's one of the female pine martens. And then this is the male pine marten. There's nothing on the camera, he just decided he fancied licking it for some strange reason. They're not very considerate of my GoPros, unfortunately. So then this here is just showing the male again. So like I say, we try to expose them to natural food resources. And something that pine martens do regularly in the wild is cache large amounts of food. So it's really positive that we've managed to see the animals doing this. You might be able to make out there's a grey squirrel that he's got stuffed up there, which he's saving for later. Their nest boxes were often filled with large amounts of the food that we'd presented them with, because they save it for later. And he's just currently digging out a grey squirrel that he stored in that log pile underneath. So what was interesting was we exposed them to several different food types. Most regularly grey squirrel, but then at one point we managed to do sort of a trial to see what the preferred food may be. So we presented them with a grey squirrel, a rat, as you can see he's trying to swing it on top of his next box, and a wood pigeon. Now the wood pigeon was what he took first, followed by the rat, and then followed by the grey squirrel. So take that what you will as to which food he might actually prefer. But he did value all three food resources because he took all of them and cached them. So it does show that they're all food that he's interested in. So from all the camera trap data that was collected, I was able to look at the activity rates. So this is the male pine marten that we were just watching. If you look in the middle here, the words might be a bit small, but this is so the activity that was done in daytime versus nighttime. So the daytime activity was much lower, about 22%, and about 70% in the nighttime, which would be expected. These animals in winter periods spend most of their activity rates over nighttime and dusk and dawn, which is also represented by sort of the peaks in activity in dusk. His sort of spread as far as active hours overall was a bit more spread out, but you'll see a bit later on, he's a world to himself, really. He's not comparable to the other two. So this is the first female. Again, the daytime versus nighttime activity was seen at a similar rate, about 20-odd% to 70-odd%. Again, main peaks at dusk and dawn. Some activity in the middle of the day, which may have been influenced by when myself and Craig were going to feed the animals. We fed them over daytime because we didn't want to go over nighttime because that would disturb them. We wanted them to have as little an association with people as possible. And again, with the final female, seeing the same sort of night versus day activity, and again, big peaks at dusk and dawn times. So the group comparisons. Pine marten A is the male, so he obviously loves food. So he would come out within about 60 seconds of anyone going and putting food, and he would then take the food away. The females, their reappearance time was much, much slower, and then his activity rates were much, much higher as far as total camera images that were collected from the camera traps in his pen. Now, whether that is because he's male or compared to the females, when more individuals are assessed for the next release stages, we'll know more about that. But for the minute, it's just quite an interesting stat. So that just shows how quickly they get around the pen and their environment, which is why most of the camera trap images were very blurry. So another aspect that I looked at was sort of personality assessment, which you can present these animals with novel stimulus. Now, personality is often used in zoos to know which individuals can be on show at certain times, which animals can be kept alongside other animals, because they work with these species every day, you get a feeling of what these animals are. And this is something that isn't done massively regularly within conservation, but it's something that could be quite useful within translocation releases. So there's been papers done on swift foxes where they looked at bold versus shyness criteria for translocation success. That basically looked at two key behavioural types, so bold responses and shy responses to novel stimulus. So the pine martens, I exposed them to 6 different stimuluses. I made sure that these were not food-based because I didn't want to trigger a food response. I wanted the response to be completely novel. And then they could be given a score of +1 if they approached the item boldly, or -1 if they approached it timidly, and the same for how they reacted then with the item. This then gave them their own individual scores, which you could then use to assess sort of how bold they are. Now, this could be linked with certain behaviours once they were released. Essentially, the early bird may catch the worm, the bolder pine marten may catch more prey, but then equally, the bolder pine marten might get hit by a car more often than a timid one because they're more inquisitive, they're less likely to avoid high-risk locations. So that, again, is something that can be a useful tool when using captive bred animals. If we'll go on. So here's just an example of exposure to the novel stimulus. So you can see the pink ball there is the novel stimulus. Now, prior to this little clip, she'd been walking around the top looking at it and not bothering with it. But then the other 2 pine martens would interact with the stimulus quite often. The female, the other female, she would cache the items. Don't know why, but she was quite often uninterested altogether. She'd smell it, probably my scent on the ball, but would not interact with them at all, really. So then another thing that we did as part of the assessment to ensure that these animals can be released into these woodlands correctly, you need to see what prey items there are for them and also what competitors there might be. So performed camera trapping just to see what animals are also in the woodlands that the pine martens are going to be going into. Found lots of interesting animals and managed to catch a buzzard on a camera trap set at knee height, which was quite lucky, really. And as you can see, there's plenty of prey items for them, a large number of grey squirrels, which we're hoping will reduce with the pine martens being there, but we'll have to wait and see. And then there's some competitors for them, which could predate on small young pine martens or may raid caches as well. But obviously, when you're restoring a total ecosystem, you've got to have collaboration between the animals that are there. There's going to be competitors, there's going to be prey items. So what's going to happen now? Well, the martens are due to be released in March. They're going to be radio collared so that they can be tracked. Camera trapping is going to be set up to try and monitor their movements. There's going to be food provision input out for them to ensure that they can survive for the first few weeks. And then also we're going to be using nest boxes as well, which have been put up all across Gwynedd, where we're hoping these animals will repopulate. And a really good way to tell if a pine marten is using a nest box is that they scat on the roof. So that's a good way. If we know where all the nest boxes are, we can go and check them. If they've got scat on top of it, then it's a pretty surefire way of knowing a pine marten is utilising it. So thank you very much. Any questions?